Steve Bantu Biko was born in 1946 in Ginsburg, a township outside King Williamstown in South Africa. Growing up under the iron grip of apartheid, he quickly learned the meaning of inequality. His family lived under constant restrictions, where they could move, what schools they could attend, even which hospitals they could enter. Yet Biko excelled academically, and his sharp intellect earned him a place at medical school at the University of Natal. It was there, in the late 1960s, that he began to question not only the brutality of apartheid, but the psychological damage it inflicted on Black South Africans. Biko was not just a student or a political activist. He was a thinker, a strategist, and ultimately a revolutionary. He believed that apartheid's greatest weapon was not just its police or its laws. It was the way it taught Black South Africans to see themselves as inferior. This realization led him to develop the Black consciousness movement. For Biko, liberation began with the mind. He urged Black South Africans to reject the lie of inferiority and reclaim pride in their identity, culture, and humanity. His message was simple but radical. Black man, you're on your own. Biko's movement spread like wildfire on campuses and in communities across South Africa. The Black consciousness movement was born in South Africa in the late 1960s when apartheid was at its height and hope seemed dim. The African National Congress, ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, had been banned, and many of their leaders were imprisoned on Robben Island. Into that political vacuum stepped a younger generation of activists, students, community leaders, and intellectuals who were searching for a new language of resistance. Steve Biko and his peers founded the South African Students' Organization, SASO, in 1968, breaking away from the white-dominated National Union of South African Students. They argued that Black South Africans could not rely on white liberals or multiracial organizations to bring liberation. Instead, they needed a movement led by and for Black people. Here, Black was not just a racial category. Under Black consciousness, the term included all those oppressed by apartheid, Africans, coloreds, and Indians. Biko emphasized that Blackness was about shared experience and solidarity, not just skin tone. At its core, Black consciousness was a psychological revolution. Biko argued that apartheid had dehumanized Black people, not only materially, but mentally, teaching them to internalize feelings of inferiority. The movement aimed to reverse this damage by instilling pride, self-confidence, and cultural affirmation. Slogans like "Black is beautiful" weren't just cosmetic. They were radical affirmations in a society built on telling Black people they were worth less. BCM spread beyond universities. It reached churches where the Black theology movement reinterpreted Christianity as a tool for liberation. It touched communities through clinics, literacy projects, and cultural groups. It gave ordinary people a sense that they were not powerless victims, but agents of change. Unsurprisingly, the apartheid government saw BCM as dangerous. By the mid-1970s, leaders were banned, arrested, or harassed. Yet the ideas could not be contained. They inspired the 1976 Soweto uprising, when school children rejected being forced to learn in Afrikaans. Though brutally suppressed, the uprising reignited resistance inside South Africa and drew the world's attention to apartheid's brutality. Biko played a crucial role in the struggle to dismantle white racist rule in South Africa. He was instrumental in founding the Radical South African Students Association and emerged as a prominent leader within the Black consciousness movement. Drawing inspiration from thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire, Malcolm X, and the U.S. Black Power movement, Biko highlighted the need to confront the internalized sense of inferiority among Black individuals. He argued that true liberation for Black people could only be achieved once they freed themselves from the psychological chains of racial oppression, famously stating that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Biko's ideas profoundly altered perceptions of the anti-apartheid struggle during a time when many leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were imprisoned and silenced. Mandela noted that Biko's work inspired oppressed people to recognize their own worth, take joy in their own humanity, and acknowledge in as equals the humanity of others. Biko's thought processes liberated minds, invigorated resistance, and revitalized a waning movement against apartheid. This resurgence coincided with the emergence of militant young activists who joined the exiled armed struggle following the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. Biko's influence shaped significant events like the massive strikes in Durban during the early 1970s and inspired the Soweto uprising in 1976, where children protested against the imposition of Afrikaans in schools, capturing global attention. As Mandela expressed, the apartheid regime was so threatened by Biko's impact that they had to kill him to prolong the life of apartheid. In 1971, Steve Biko delivered a powerful speech at a nationwide multiracial student conference where he expressed his insights on the relationship between white racism and black consciousness. He recognized the strength that could emerge from black solidarity. The black consciousness movement gained significant traction among the youth and played a crucial role in igniting the Soweto uprising of 1976, which contributed to a revival of the national freedom movement. The apartheid government saw Biko as a threat. By the early 1970s, he was banned, forbidden to speak publicly, publish his writing, or even meet with more than one person at a time. But silence could not contain him. His ideas spread underground, carried by students, activists, and ordinary people who had found new dignity through black consciousness. In 1976, the Soweto uprising erupted when school children protested against being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor. Police opened fire, killing hundreds. Biko's movement was not the sole cause of the uprising, but his influence was unmistakable. His ideas had seeded a culture of defiance. In August 1977, Biko was arrested by security police. He was brutally interrogated, tortured, and beaten into a coma. Shackled and naked, he was driven hundreds of miles to a prison hospital where he died on September 12, 1977. He was just 30 years old. His death shocked the world. International outrage mounted, and Biko became a symbol of both apartheid's cruelty and the unbreakable spirit of resistance. Although a political cover-up ensued, the truth about his death surfaced, revealing the violent nature of the apartheid state. His demise intensified international pressure against white minority rule, ultimately contributing to the end of apartheid alongside the movement he inspired. Steve Biko didn't live long enough to write books in the conventional sense, but his speeches, essays, and interviews were collected after his death and published in two key volumes that continue to shape political thought today. The first is I Write What I Like, a collection of Biko's writings from 1969 to 1972. It's an unfiltered account of his philosophy and the birth of the Black consciousness movement. In these pages, you hear Biko's voice at its sharpest, analytical, uncompromising, and deeply committed to psychological liberation. He challenged not only apartheid, but also liberal white allies who believed they could speak for Black South Africans. For Biko, liberation meant rejecting all paternalism and affirming the right of Black people to define their own future. The second is Black consciousness in South Africa, which gathers speeches and interviews from the early 1970s. Here, Biko's ideas come alive in dialogue, and he explains Black consciousness as both a philosophy and a strategy, a way to build pride, unity, and political strength among the oppressed. These texts show him not just as a thinker, but as a leader deeply rooted in community struggle. Together, these works form the intellectual backbone of the Black consciousness movement. They remind us that Biko was not simply reacting to apartheid brutality, he was building a positive, life-affirming vision of Black identity and freedom.
Samora Machel was born in 1933 in rural Mozambique. then a Portuguese colony. He grew up in a farming family, working the fields and experiencing firsthand the heavy hand of colonial rule. Education was scarce for black Mozambicans, but young Samora showed remarkable drive. He trained as a nurse, one of the few professions open to Africans under colonialism, and soon discovered how deeply the colonial system even infected healthcare. Hospitals were segregated. African patients were treated as second class. For Machel, medicine became more than a vocation. It was the beginning of a political awakening. Samora Machel was not a politician in the traditional sense. He was a revolutionary forged in the crucible of liberation struggles. In the early 1960s, he joined Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, and quickly rose through its ranks. Machel was not only a fighter, he was a strategist and a charismatic leader who believed liberation required both guns and ideas. By the mid-1960s, Machel was leading guerrilla campaigns against Portuguese forces, drawing inspiration from anti-colonial struggles across Africa. Like Fanon in Algeria, he understood that colonialism was not only military occupation, it was a system that sought to dominate minds, cultures, and futures. As commander of Frelimo's army, Machel proved himself both disciplined and visionary. He insisted that fighters respect the civilian population. No looting, no mistreatment. Guerrilla warfare, in his vision, was not just about defeating the Portuguese military. It was about building trust with Mozambicans in the liberated zones. The rich man's dog gets more in the way of vaccination, medicine, and medical care than the worker on whose back the rich man rides and builds his wealth. This was classic Samora Machel, blunt, uncompromising, and always connecting the fight against colonialism with the fight for human dignity. When Mozambique finally won independence in 1975, Samora Machel became the country's first president. His government declared a socialist path, nationalizing land, industry, and healthcare. Under his leadership, Mozambique made major advances in literacy and public health, especially for rural communities long neglected under Portuguese rule. But independence came with new struggles. Mozambique faced sabotage and the destabilization by the apartheid regime in South Africa and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The apartheid government armed the Renamo insurgency, plunging Mozambique into a devastating civil war. Machel's young nation became a frontline state in the wider Southern African fight against white minority rule. Samora Machel's influence stretched beyond Mozambique. He was a staunch ally of liberation movements in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. He worked closely with leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and Agostinho Neto in Angola to push for regional unity. International solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains toward the same objectives. That spirit of solidarity made Mozambique both a beacon of hope and a target of destabilization. In 1986, tragedy struck. Samora Machel's plane crashed near the South African border, killing him and 33 others. The circumstances remain suspicious. Many believe apartheid South Africa played a role in the crash. His death was a heavy blow, not only for Mozambique, but for liberation movements across Southern Africa. Yet, even in death, Machel's vision endured. His speeches, his commitment to socialism, and his insistence on linking political freedom with human dignity continue to inspire new generations. Today, nearly 4 decades after his death, Machel's legacy still resonates. His call for unity and dignity feels urgent in a world where inequality, neo-colonial economics, and cultural domination persist. His life reminds us that independence is not a finish line, but a beginning, a struggle that must be renewed with every generation. From movements for economic justice in Africa to global campaigns against exploitation, Samora Machel's voice still speaks. Freedom is incomplete without equality, and solidarity is the heartbeat of liberation. Samora Machel was more than Mozambique's first president. He was a revolutionary flame, one that continues to burn across southern Africa and beyond.
Dr. Walter Rodney was born in Georgetown, Guyana in 1942. From an early age, he was known as a brilliant student, winning scholarships that took him first to Jamaica and then to the University of the West Indies. He later earned his PhD in African history at XOAS in London at just 24 years old. Rodney's brilliance was matched by his activism. He taught in Tanzania and Jamaica, always bringing history into dialogue with the struggles of ordinary people. His life was cut short when he was assassinated in 1980 at the age of 38. But his work, especially his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, remains one of the most influential texts in Pan-African thought. Rodney was not the kind of scholar who stayed locked in the academy. He was a man of the people. He would leave the lecture halls and sit in the streets of Kingston, Jamaica, talking with Rastafarians, working class youth, and activists. This made him dangerous in the eyes of the establishment. In 1968, while teaching in Jamaica, Rodney was banned from re-entering the country after attending a Black Writers Conference in Montreal and speaking out against racial injustice, capitalism, and neo-colonial exploitation. This ban sparked the famous Rodney riots in Kingston, where students, workers, and the poor flooded the streets in protest. The government responded with heavy repression, but the riots became a symbol of Rodney's influence, showing that his ideas resonated not only in lecture halls, but also in the grassroots struggles of ordinary people. The Rodney riots marked him as a revolutionary intellectual who threatened entrenched power, and they cemented his reputation as a voice for the voiceless across the Caribbean and Africa. For Rodney, history was never abstract. It was about power, who wields it, and who suffers under it. His sharpest tool for exposing this was his groundbreaking book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Published in 1972, Rodney's book was a bombshell. It flipped the common narrative. Instead of asking why Africa was backward, he asked, who made Africa underdeveloped? His answer was direct. Europe did, through centuries of exploitation. Rodney shows that the Atlantic slave trade drained Africa of millions of its strongest people. Entire communities were destabilized. This wasn't just a human tragedy, it was an economic sabotage that stunted African societies while fueling Europe's rise. African development was blunted, and Africa's loss was Europe's gain. The two are inseparable. This was Rodney's central argument. Underdevelopment wasn't accidental. Africa's poverty and Europe's wealth are two sides of the same coin. When formal colonialism began in the 19th century, Rodney argues, it was not about civilizing Africa, but about extracting resources, cash crops, mining, forced labor, all designed to enrich Europe while locking Africa into dependency. The riches that went out of Africa did not leave Africa with a chance to develop. They left Africa underdeveloped. In other words, Europe's prosperity was financed by Africa's exploitation. And once wealth was drained, the continent was left with fragile economies designed only to serve foreign needs. Rodney also critiques the role of local collaborators, chiefs, middlemen, and later the post-independence bourgeoisie, who became intermediaries in systems of exploitation. This, he says, kept wealth concentrated in a small elite while the masses remained poor. Rodney's most important idea is that underdevelopment is not a natural state. Africa wasn't behind Europe. Rather, Europe actively underdeveloped Africa through economic exploitation, political domination, and cultural manipulation. The question is not whether Africa is underdeveloped, but how it was underdeveloped in relation to Europe. Rodney turns the question back on the world. Instead of blaming Africa, we must look at Europe's role in manufacturing this imbalance. Even though Rodney wrote in 1972, his arguments echo loudly today. When we ask today why Africa continues to face poverty, instability, and external dependency, Rodney's answer still holds weight. Look at the structures of global power. Ask not why Africa lags, but who profits from Africa's condition. Walter Rodney's life was short, but his voice still calls out across decades. He taught us that history is a weapon, and the question is, how will we use it? On June 13th, 1980, Walter Rodney was killed by a car bomb in Georgetown, Guyana. He was just 38 years old. The bomb was reportedly handed to him by Gregory Smith, a sergeant in the Guyana Defense Force. Many believe, and later investigations strongly suggested, that Rodney's assassination was orchestrated by the government of then Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, who saw Rodney and his Working People's Alliance as a political threat. The Commission of Inquiry held decades later concluded that the state bore responsibility for his death. But whether or not every detail is known, one fact is clear. Rodney was eliminated because his ideas were too dangerous for the establishment. In the final analysis, people must be prepared to struggle for their own liberation. No one else can give it to them. Walter Rodney. Patrice Lumumba was a leader who inspired millions, a symbol of African independence and pan-Africanism, but whose life was tragically cut short. This is the story of his rise, struggles, and legacy. Born on July 2nd, 1925, in the small village of Onalua in Kasai Province, Belgian Congo, Lumumba was the son of a poor farmer. From humble beginnings, he would go on to become one of Africa's most prominent leaders. After attending a Protestant mission school, Lumumba found work in Kindu-Por-Empang, where he became involved with the Evalue's Western Educated Africans Club. He began writing essays and poems for various Congolese journals and successfully applied for full Belgian citizenship. Lumumba then relocated to Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, to work as a postal clerk, eventually advancing to the position of accountant at the post office in Stanleyville, now Kisangani, where he continued to contribute to the Congolese press. In the 1950s, as Congo began to demand independence from Belgian colonial rule, Lumumba emerged as a charismatic leader. In 1955, Lumumba became the regional president of a purely Congolese trade union for government employees, which was independent from the two Belgian trade union federations, Socialist and Roman Catholic, that other unions were aligned with. He also became involved with the Belgian Liberal Party in the Congo. Although the party held conservative views, it was not connected to the trade union federations which opposed it. In 1956, Lumumba was invited, along with others, to participate in a study tour of Belgium organized by the Minister of Colonies. Upon his return, he was arrested for allegedly embezzling funds from the post office. After various reductions in his sentence, he was convicted and sentenced to 12 months in prison and a fine a year later. Once released from prison, Lumumba became increasingly active in politics. In October 1958, he and other Congolese leaders founded the Congolese National Movement, Mouvement National Congolais, MNC, which was the first nationwide political party in Congo. In December, he participated in the first All-African Peoples Conference in Accra, Ghana, where he met nationalists from different parts of Africa and became a member of the conference's permanent organization. His perspective and language, now influenced by Pan-African ambitions, took on a more militant nationalist tone. 1955, Lumumba joins the nationalist movement. As nationalist sentiments grew stronger, the Belgian government announced a program aimed at leading the Congo toward independence, starting with local elections in December 1959. The nationalists viewed this initiative as a tactic to install puppet leaders before independence and declared a boycott of the elections. In response, the Belgian authorities resorted to repression. A clash in Stanleyville on October 30th resulted in 30 deaths, and Lumumba was arrested for inciting a riot. The MNC decided to change its approach, participated in the elections, and achieved a remarkable victory in Stanleyville, securing 90% of the votes. In January 1960, the Belgian government called a roundtable conference in Brussels with representatives from all Congolese parties to discuss political changes, but the MNC refused to join without Lumumba. Consequently, Lumumba was released from prison and flown to Brussels. The conference established June 30th as the date for independence, with national elections scheduled for May. Despite the presence of multiple parties, the MNC emerged as the clear leader in the elections, and Lumumba became the foremost nationalist politician in the Congo. Attempts to block his rise to power failed, and he was invited to form the first government. Shortly after the independence date of June 30th, certain military units revolted, primarily due to concerns regarding their Belgian commander. Moise Tshombe exploited the resulting chaos to announce that the mineral-rich province of Katanga was seceding from the Congo. In response, Belgium deployed troops, claiming it was to protect Belgian nationals amidst the turmoil, but these forces primarily landed in Katanga, where they supported Tshombe's breakaway regime. The Congo sought assistance from the United Nations to remove the Belgians and restore internal order. As Prime Minister, Lumumba did what he could to mitigate the crisis. However, his army was an unreliable source of power, his civilian administration inexperienced, and the UN forces whose presence he had requested were patronizing and assertive. The political alliances sustaining his government were also fragile. The Belgian troops remained, and the Katanga secession persisted. As the UN forces declined to help quell the Katangese uprising, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for aircraft to aid in transporting his troops to Katanga. He also called for independent African nations to convene in Leopoldville in August to rally support for his cause. These actions raised concerns among many, especially Western powers and supporters of President Kasavubu, who advocated for a moderate approach within the coalition government and favored some degree of local autonomy for the provinces. On September 5th, President Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba, but Lumumba immediately challenged the legality of this decision. Consequently, two factions emerged, both claiming to be the legitimate central government. On September 14th, power was taken by Colonel Joseph Mobutu, the leader of the Congolese army, who would later become president of Zaire as Mobutu Sese Seko, who subsequently formed a cooperative agreement with Kasavubu. In November, the United Nations General Assembly recognized the credentials of Kasavubu's government, leading to a significant rift among independent African nations over the matter. Meanwhile, in October, Lumumba had been placed under house arrest in Leopoldville, guarded not only by Mobutu's forces, but by those of the UN as well. After the General Assembly decided to recognize Kasavubu's government, Lumumba escaped from home confinement and sought to travel to Stanleyville, where his supporters had control. However, he was caught by Mobutu's forces and arrested on December 2nd. Lumumba was initially held at a military camp in Thaisville, now Mbanza Ngungu, but concerns that the soldiers there were sympathetic to him led Belgian, Congolese, and Katangan authorities to arrange for his transfer to a different location that they deemed to be more secure and one that would almost certainly guarantee his death. On January 17th, 1961, Lumumba and two associates, Joseph Okido and Maurice Impolo, were flown to Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, where they were delivered to the secessionist regime in Katanga and its Belgian advisors. On the flight there, they had been beaten by the soldiers escorting them, and once they landed in Katanga, they were beaten again. Later that day, Lumumba, Okito, and Mopolo were executed by a firing squad under Belgian command. Although their bodies were initially thrown into shallow graves, they were later dug up under the direction of Belgian officers, hacked into pieces, and dissolved in acid. The Katangan government withheld official announcement of his death until February 13th. and then claimed that Lumumba had escaped from their custody and had been discovered by villagers who killed him. Rumors of Lumumba's death had circulated soon after it occurred, however. The government's explanation of his death was quickly disputed, although it would take decades for the full circumstances surrounding his death to be made public. His death caused a scandal throughout Africa and beyond. Belgian soldiers who oversaw or were party to the dissolution of the African leader's body collected Lumumba's gold tooth as a trophy. The macabre artifact was finally returned to his family after 61 years, not with a formal apology, but only with an acknowledgement that a great harm had been done. Lumumba's assassination was a turning point, a tragic chapter in the post-colonial history of Africa, marking the extent of Western involvement in African affairs. Despite his death, Lumumba's legacy continues to inspire political leaders, activists, and people across the world who seek freedom and justice.
If this episode moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe so this work can grow and reach others. Knowledge becomes power only when it circulates, and together we can build a community that refuses silence, forgetfulness, and distortion. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.